In this short video, I'm going to share with you the process of my most epic painting to date. Roll that intro. How's it going? I hope you're well and welcome back to my channel. It is so good to be back with you once again. Now, in my absence, I've been working away here in the studio, finishing off a really epic project, and it's now time that I share that painting with you. Now, this painting depicts Karijini National Park at the top of Western Australia. I've actually been painting Karijini for many years, and one of the things that draws me to this place is that vastness of space. I love the way that heat reverberates out of that rock and those rich reds that you can get there. There's nothing quite like it. And the extraordinary variety of the vegetation. Again, this is a totally unique place. Now, this particular painting was a commission, and as I was beginning to hear the brief, I started to realize that I was going to need to get reacquainted with this scene and look at it from a completely unique point of view. Now, this particular part of Karijini National Park is called Oxer's Lookout. It's the place where 5 gorges converge. It's really the heart of Karijini. When you're looking at it from the overlook, the scene is pretty spectacular, but I was going to want to look at it from above and look at all of those gorges converging at this one central point, but also take into account the vastness of space, whilst simultaneously being able to see all the way into the depth of the gorge. This painting was going to have to cover a massive amount of area, so naturally it was going to have to be quite large. Now, before starting such a project, I need a plan, and I've shared with you in other videos how I go about designing my paintings. This painting really was no different. I had a whole bunch of reference material that I gathered from the field, and the most reliable stuff that I had was the drone footage looking down into the gorge, these panning shots. So I took some still frames and stitched them together, and this gave me a really good indication of what the final painting might look like. But there was a couple of things missing. First, the light was really inconsistent. On some of these shots, it was quite overcast, and I got no direct light there. In other circumstances, the wind kind of blew the drone out of the area where I needed to be photographing from, but also it was overexposed or underexposed. So this was a real challenge to get around. There was no way really to tackle it other than to draw it from scratch. So I have a digital process where I'm drawing using a Wacom tablet directly into Photoshop and building the image up with layers. I start with one design, which initially this was going to be a vertical scene, but then the client changed their mind and wanted to take in more vastness of this space, and I created a landscape scene. So this was the final design that I decided to roll with and transfer directly to the canvas.
Now, this painting is going to be absolutely massive. The stretcher measures 60 inches by 84 inches, or 152 centimeters by 213. I love hand stretching the supports that I paint on. I try to ensure that there's no wrinkles at all on the surface. I install some wedge blocks on the back. These correspond to those long railings on the wall easel and help attach the painting, and then tack in some corner wedges to help me adjust the tension on the surface. Now, I'm often asked about the materials that I use, so let's go over that now. Again, starting with the linen. So here I'm painting on Bell Arty linen, and this is a coarse weave that has been acrylic primed. I prefer the acrylic priming because it's a lot more durable and flexible and is really preferable when I'm shipping my work rolled, sending it overseas. The oil paints I use are made by Blue Ridge. These are handmade in North Carolina, and I just love them. My initial palette is made up of burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, titanium white, and Crimnance white mixed together at a 50-50 ratio. I then have some quinacridone magenta, cobalt teal, and ultramarine blue. As I progress with the painting, I start adding more and more intense colors and start to play with transparency as well, so some of these tubes are definitely going to be handy. I mix the paint with medium. This changes the drying properties and the characteristics of the paint. I start off with Liquid Original. This is an alkyd resin which helps adjust the flow. I'm never adding any more than 25% to the paint, so that's 1 part medium to 3 parts paint. For the fine details, I use Liquid Fine Detail, which is a lot thinner than the Liquid Original. And for extra heavy impasto-like texture, I use Liquid Impasto. This stuff is great, it's really easy to use, and it's really durable, especially on a big painting. The brushes I use change depending on the stage in the process that I'm in. Initially, I build up the image with big bristle brushes. My favorite is the dagger. As the painting progresses, the brushes get smaller and smaller until I end up with these fine synthetic brushes. Some of my favorites are this Eclipse long filbert. I also have an ivory dagger here, a 000 pointed round, and a round ivory rigger. That's going to be very handy for some of the seed heads on the Spinifex. I apply a very light wash to the canvas and let this sink in and dry completely before I begin to transfer my design. It's vitally important before beginning such a large project to have a plan, which leads me to tip number 1, have a plan. So now that I have my design, I'm ready to transfer this directly to the canvas. And the easiest, fastest, and best way to do this is using a digital projector. Now, before anybody decides to throw shade my way, this is actually my own design. It was a drawing, so I'm not actually projecting a photograph. It's a means to an end, and I find this just super helpful when it comes to transferring such a large image. Now, my initial palette is very simple indeed. I've got to cover a lot of ground quickly, and I want nice clean color. So here on my palette, I have cobalt teal, ultramarine blue, quinacridone magenta, that combination of white that I discussed earlier, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and burnt umber. The easiest place to start is the sky, so I work those most distant tiers of depth and come all the way forward towards the viewer. So these combinations and the higher reaches of the painting are going to be very simple. The main mix is ultramarine blue and white, kicking that saturation with some burnt umber, and then adjusting the color with hints of cobalt teal, balancing that out with a touch of quinacridone magenta. I cover color mixing in a bit more detail in the full version of this tutorial. Now, the trick to covering area quickly is to use more paint. This doesn't necessarily mean thinning the paint down so much with medium. Again, I'm only using 1 part medium to 3 parts paint here. But it's about just mixing more of a volume and having that available on the palette, and then working this into the surface just 1 brushstroke at a time. I'm always trying to create that illusion of 3-dimensional depth and space within my paintings. So what helps me with this is holding back with those tones and those colors in the far reaches of the painting. Here, I'm only using yellow ochre for the yellow to mix some of these grains. This will get progressively more saturated as I bring the tiers of depth forward. The shadows will also get slightly darker, and those highlights are going to get much more intense as I begin to approach the foreground. The block-in is just a simple approach to putting the composition on the canvas immediately. I'm working in big zones, bringing the edges of those zones together and just going from zone to zone, working from the distant reaches of the painting all the way into the foreground. And even though I'm working with broad, blocky shapes of color, I still want to have enough information there to inform the next stage of the process, which is the modeling. All up, a painting of this size would take me about 2 to 3 days to block in. This is actually a lot more complicated than my ordinary work, so I gave it a bit of extra time. The reds that I'm achieving here in this block-in stage are just burnt sienna with a touch of quinacridone magenta and a little bit of yellow ochre. I haven't gotten out any saturated red just yet. That's coming in the next part of the process. In fact, red is quite a tricky color. If we get too much of it out too early, we'll completely lose the effect of saturation. I want that intensity of the red rock to really shine through. In the foreground, some cool shadows help me balance out some of those warmer tones. And what helps me achieve that cool is the cobalt teal and quinacridone magenta combinations. Every single part of this painting that you see now will be completely covered again and again and again, next with that modeling stage, and then with several layers of intricate detail. Now I'm 3 days in and the block-in is finished. I'm pretty happy with this result. I'm going to let this layer dry completely and then come back with the next layer of modeling. It's got everything here. All of the zones are clearly identified and I'm pretty happy with the perspective so far. Now, when we're creating a monumental painting, it's really important that we have a plan and we work that plan. But the next thing that we need is we need to have a system. Now, this is just one system. It's just what works for me. You might have your own, but I encourage you to try this if you haven't before. So this is a 3-part process of blocking in, modeling, and then detail, and layering in accordance with those passes in each stage. That way, we can keep track of our results and we don't seem to get too bogged down at any one stage. We know that this is a sequential thing. I'm not finishing off any area at a time. I'm just working all the way across and bringing the painting up as a whole. So for tip number 2, have a system. So the next little part of my system here is once the block is done, I actually go around each and every little aspect of this rocky painting and delineate individual areas and break them up further. Here I'm just using some burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and a bit of burnt umber to create a nice rich red tone. And this is just helping me identify in a little more clarity different aspects of each individual zone in the painting. This is vital information, helping me know exactly where I'm going to put those strokes of color in the modeling phase. Now, when I'm modeling, I like to apply a nice painterly technique. This is where I work wet into wet and start to really flesh out the tones and the colors in each area of the painting. I work along in a very similar fashion to the block end, starting with whatever's furthest away, working those tiers of depth all the way forward towards the foreground. The block end layer is completely dry, aided by that liquid original, which dries overnight. So here I'm working over a nice dried layer and I'm not picking up much of that underground color at all. These fresh layers of paint are going down beautifully, and I'm starting to get more thickness in those strokes. This is a particularly involved painting, and that spin effects adds to the complication. There are so many individual little tiny pincushion bushes that scatter themselves across this scene. When viewed from a distance, they seem perfectly innocent, but trust me, if you ever stub your toe on one of these things, or kick it even with a leather boot on, it's going straight through. Now, I like to treat each and every one of these little grass bushes as a 3-dimensional form in its own right, but sometimes at a vast depth, it's not going to show up as much more than a little dot of color. The rocks here are pretty similar in that respect to the Spinifex bushes. It's very much like a Mandelbrot set. If you know that fractal pattern, you look at these big shapes that are divided into smaller shapes, and even smaller shapes, and it really can do your head in when you're looking at the painting up close. So stepping away regularly, viewing the painting from a distance, can help you know if you're on the right track. Now, it's at this point in the painting process where things start to grind down to a slow and tedious pace. Sometimes you feel like you're not making much progress at all, but it's really important to stick with it. So for my third tip,
just do it!
That's right, there's only one way to do it, and that is to just do it. You've just got to get stuck in, put one foot in front of another, put one brush stroke on top of another, and just keep plugging away. Part of the brief for this painting was to make it as detailed as possible, which means I have to focus on each and every aspect of the painting surface and faithfully render that and detail it so that it really communicates rock or trees, even coming down to the individual leaves on these rock figs that are growing out of the cliff. These rock figs are really cool, and they add a really nice pop of green that reverberates against that red. They're found everywhere throughout these canyons in Carragini National Park. Now notice the change in the size of the brush. We've gone from a big 1-inch Tischler dagger all the way to a 00 pointed round. This is going to take ages, but the end result is going to be well worth it.
Make your dreams come true!
Now the synthetic brushes really help me apply those finer details. Here, I'm using an ivory dagger. It's great for some of those precise lines. For some of the shadows between the rocks, I use an evergreen filbert and apply a much thinner, darker glaze. Here I'm actually using some liquid fine detail to help thin down that paint. I tend to keep my shadows thinner than those highlight areas. I use the texture of the paint and even add to the body of the paint itself by mixing in some liquid impasto. Some of the thicker areas are going to be amongst the trees or even those edges of the rock shelves that face upwards and catch more of that light. Thicker paint reflects more light back towards the viewer, and this can help create some really cool three-dimensional effects. I really like to build up an intricate, detailed surface that is a multitude of so many different strokes of color with varying thicknesses. When you look up close, it might seem rather chaotic, but when you stand back, the whole thing comes together. This is what I love about painting. Now, another thing that helps create three-dimensionality and depth is glazing. I mix up a very thin light glaze and apply this over a dry painting. The thinner lighter glaze is comprised of Kremnitz white, ultramarine blue, and quinacridone magenta, and I reserve this for the far reaches of the painting, adding a layer of atmosphere. I apply with a dry brush and then wipe away off the high points with a clean rag. I rely on the transparency of the colors that I'm using, not on copious amounts of medium. This is still 1 part medium to 3 parts paint. And the same goes for the dark shadows. I adjust these with a combination of transparent red oxide and turquoise phthalo. I brush this into some of those shadow areas and then wipe away off the top where I have a rock shelf where I want to reflect more light. I keep reflections in water pretty transparent as well. Here, this is a combination of that Kremnitz white, ultramarine blue, and quinacridone magenta with just a hint of cobalt teal. This is just floating on the surface, and again, I only apply glazes over a dried painting. This is a part of the painting process I've been dreading, and that's painting each one of those seed heads that protrudes from the top of the spinifex bushes. There were several late nights working on this painting to just try and push through and get the job done. Even though I did take breaks from this project, every time I stepped away, I had that voice in the back of my mind.
Just do it!
This was a really epic project, my most significant work to date, and certainly the most complicated painting I've ever attempted. I am really happy though, now that this project's finished. I felt it captured that feeling of looking at the landscape with each individual aspect of these intricate canyons, from the geology to that incredible vegetation scattered across the scene. In the end, I got pretty good at painting tiny little trees. There's about 427 here all up. I'm not even going to begin to attempt to count each individual seed head on that spinifex grass. Now, as this work was a commission, I can't share with you who actually bought it, or what they said in their email when they were reacting to the final result, but suffice to say, this pretty well sums up their reaction.
I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. It is such a pleasure to be back with you once again. I really look forward to sharing more videos with you over 2021. Now, this particular project was my most epic painting to date. It's been in the studio now for about 2.5 years. It took me about 6 months all up in working time to complete it, and now I'm about to roll this thing up and ship it to its new home. I must admit, I get quite attached to paintings if I've been working on them for a really long time, and I'm really going to miss this one. So, what did we learn here in today's video? Let's share again those top 3 tips for tackling an epic project. Tip number 1 is to have a plan, and you saw here that I had that digital design, so I really knew where I was going with this particular painting. Tip number 2, have a system. I've shared with you in this video a little bit about my process of how I build a large painting like this. And tip number 3, there's no way around it. You just have to do it and stick with it. Now, if you'd like more information on how I completed this particular project, then a tutorial is available right now on my website. You can find that by clicking the link in the description down below. If ever you want to know what materials I'm using, you're going to find those links down below as well. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook. Most important though, make sure you're subscribed through my website at andrewtischler.com. Thanks so much for stopping by. I look forward to hanging out with you again very soon. So long.